It was hard to get used to silence after Mr. Oliver passed away. For 5 years, he was my neighbor in the small apartment, and his presence always brought me a sense of security. Every early evening, he hit the wall 3 times that divided our apartments, our particular form of communication. It was usually to borrow sugar for your night coffee, but sometimes I just wanted to confirm if I was okay, especially after my husband left. Mr. Oliver had this protective way of grandfather I never had, and our little kindness routine had become one of the few comforting certainties of my life. The night I received the news of his death, I was paralyzed looking at that wall for hours. The paramedics said it was a fulminant heart attack. He was sitting on his old brown leather armchair, the one that ranged in a characteristic way every time he was straightening to watch the night newspaper. His cup of coffee was still halfway through the table next to it, and the sugar I had loaned the night before remained untouched over the saucers. That night, I slept on the living room couch, unable to climb to my bedroom. The silence was deafening, and the absence of those 3 familiar beats caused me an anguish that I could not explain. The first week after his death was a blur of measures and visits from the few relatives he had. I found that Mr. Oliver had been a widower for over a decade and his only son lived abroad. The boy came only to the funeral and, 2 days later, was already organizing the sale of the house. I offered to buy some furniture, especially that leather armchair that, for some reason, felt that I needed to keep around. The son agreed without hesitation, clearly eager to solve everything as soon as possible. The next day, when the porters brought the armchair to my living room, I felt a strange shiver to see how it seemed to be perfectly belonged to that space, as if waiting to be there. It was the 3rd night after the armchair arrived that it all started. I was lying on the couch, almost sleeping when I heard 3 soft beats on the wall. My heart stopped for a second. The sound was so familiar that, on instinct, I almost got up to get the sugar in the kitchen. But then, my mind remembered. Mr. Oliver was dead. The air around me seemed heavier, and a shiver went up on my neck. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I was motionless, my eyes fixed on the wall, waiting. The silence came back, heavy and suffocating. But now there was something different in him, as if he was loaded with expectation. I tried to convince myself that it was imagination, just longing and tiredness. But when I turned to go to sleep, I heard a creak from the room, the unmistakable sound of the leather armchair. My body froze. The room was empty, wasn't it? I turned slowly, feeling my heart to fire. The leather still looked needed, as if someone had just gotten up. It was exactly the same sound she did when Mr. Oliver was settling to find a more comfortable position. But now the armchair was empty, I was sure, because I had just passed it. I went down the stairs slowly, each step looking heavier than the previous one. The room was exactly as I had left. The TV still turned on, throwing restless shadows on the walls, and the armchair was still, but the leather was still slightly wrinkled, as if someone had just gotten up. The smell of coffee broke into my nostrils, strong and recent, even if I had not made coffee that night. My hands began to tremble when I noticed, over the table beside the armchair, a moist circular brand, as if a cup had been placed there a few moments ago. I ran to the switch and lit all the lights, my tight chest with a mixture of fear and a strange feeling of familiarity. The smell of coffee remained, but now it was mixed with that old colony that Mr. Oliver always used, an aroma that I would recognize anywhere. The 3 beats sounded back on the wall, higher this time, more insistent. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't stress, it wasn't longing. It was real, terribly real. I grabbed my cell phone and called my sister, the words running over as I tried to explain what was going on, but she just suggested that I take a soothing and try to sleep. I hung up the phone, feeling even more alone and scared. It was then that I noticed something that made my stomach sink. There were damp footprints on the floor, starting in the armchair and following to the wall that divided the houses. They were slippers of slippers, just like those Mr. Oliver used to use. They seemed to have been made with coffee, leaving a dark brown trail on the wooden floor. I followed the path of the footsteps with their eyes until they disappeared as they arrived on the wall. The same wall from which the beats came, the same wall that had been our form of communication for years. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, shrunk under a blanket, watching the armchair and wall alternately. The beats continued at irregular intervals, sometimes so soft that they seemed like a dream, sometimes so strong that they made their paintings shudder. The smell of coffee and came, as was the grinding of the armchair. At some point in the morning, exhausted and delirious of fear, I realized that there was something different in the standard of the beats. It was no longer the 3 usual beats, now they formed a rhythm, as if they tried to communicate something which I should understand. When the sun finally began to be born, I reunited all my courage and did something I had not done since Mr. Oliver's death. I entered the apartment next door. His son had given me a copy of the key to show the property to possible buyers, but I had not yet been able to use. The apartment was exactly as it had been left, except for a disturbing detail. In the kitchen, on the table, there was a cup of still hot coffee, and next to it, a note written with the unmistakable handwriting of Mr. Oliver. "Do you still have sugar to lend me? Neighboring?" The paper was stained with coffee drops, forming the same standard as the footprints in my room. The coffee stains on the ticket began to spread, forming something new. The lyrics trembled, as if they were being written by invisible hands. "I miss you," said the new message. My chest squeezed. But then more words began to emerge, blurred and hurriedly. "Get out now, before they realize." A sharp cold filled the kitchen, and the smell of coffee intensified so much that it began to give me nausea. I tried to run to the door, but my feet looked attached to the floor. The creak of the armchair echoed through the empty apartment, but now it didn't come from my room. It came from the apparatus of Mr. Oliver, where I knew there was an identical armchair that his son didn't want to take. The beats on the wall started again, but now they came from all directions, as if the walls were alive and pulsating. The coffee in the cup began to bubble and overflow, dripping through the table toward the floor, forming more footprints that moved alone. They no longer disappeared on the wall, now they climbed through it, as if someone was walking vertically. The note in my hands began to burn, not with fire, but with a heat that came from inside the paper, and the words still changed. "You need to leave now. They are coming back. They always come back at 3 in the morning." I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, 5 minutes left for 3 in the morning. Panic took over me when I realized that the coffee footprints now formed a circle around me, and the smell of Mr. Oliver's colony was so strong that it could barely breathe. The walls began to throb faster, the beats now synchronized like a giant heart. The coffee was still dripping from the cup, but now it was black as pitch and looked denser, almost alive. Upstairs, the armchair grinds non-stop, as if someone was frantically swinging in it. That's when I understood Mr. Oliver wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to warn me. The beats on the wall have never been just a habit. Now that he is gone, they have come back. And this time I was alone. The clock began to bat hour, scoring 3 hours, and the lights blinked. In the dark, I could see other shapes moving on the walls, shadows that did not belong to this world, and heard voices, dozens of them, whispering my name. In a desperate movement, I finally managed to free myself and ran toward the door, but something grabbed my ankle. It was coffee on the floor, now with the consistency of tar, rising down my leg. The voices got higher, and I recognized Mr. Oliver's, shouting that I would run away. The air was heavy, as if loaded with static, and felt cold hands touching my shoulders, my face, my neck. The shadows on the walls began to detach, taking vaguely human forms, all moving toward me. Amid chaos, I heard Mr. Oliver's voice clearly. "Close your eyes, Marina. Don't look at them. Never look at them." I obeyed instinctively, closing his eyes tightly as he felt those presences approaching increasingly. The smell of coffee has mixed with another odor, something rotten and old, like open tombs. The voices increased until they shouted, and I felt something sticky running down the walls, dripping on my face. I don't know how long I was there, paralyzed, but when I finally opened my eyes, I was sitting in Mr. Oliver's armchair in my room, the morning sun entering the windows. There were no coffee stains on the floor, no tickets, no footprints. On the wall, written with dry coffee, were the words, "Never answer the beats. They are listening."